Picture this, a block of stone the size of a house, perfectly cut, perfectly fitted against the block beside it, and the block beside that, and the one after that, without a single drop of mortar holding them together. You could slide a razor blade into the seam, and it would catch on nothing. These stones weigh over 100 tons each. They were quarried miles away. They were transported over mountains. They were lifted and locked into position with a geometric precision that embarrasses modern surveyors. And carbon dating puts the site at somewhere between 12,000 and 50,000 years old. Not 5,000, not 10,000, 50,000. Tens of thousands of years before humans were supposed to know how to do any of this. Now here's the question that should stop you cold. The question that mainstream archaeology has been quietly avoiding for decades. What if everything you've ever been taught about human history is a lie? Not a small lie. Not a matter of a few missing footnotes. A foundational lie. The kind that, once you see through it, makes every museum exhibit and every school textbook feel like a carefully constructed stage set. Because here's what the evidence, not the myths, not the conspiracy theories, the actual physical evidence buried in sediment layers and encoded in ancient stone, is beginning to suggest. We are not the first. We are not even close to the first. We are, if certain patterns in the archaeological record are to be believed, the seventh. 7 civilizations rose on this planet. 7 reached for something remarkable. And 6 of them were wiped so completely from the surface of the earth that we're still arguing about whether they existed at all. Tonight, we're going to go looking for them. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When you imagine human history, what shape does it take in your mind? Most of us picture a line, a long, mostly upward line. At the far left end, primitive, grunting, barely surviving, huddled in cold caves with crude stone tools and animal skins, and then slowly, painfully slowly, the line climbs. Fire, language, agriculture, cities, writing, bronze, iron, steam, electricity, silicon. And here, at the far right end of the line, at the tip of the arrow, is us. The most advanced, the most knowledgeable, the most technologically capable version of the human story that has ever existed. It's a comforting shape. It implies purpose. It implies progress. It implies that we, standing here right now, are the culmination of everything that came before. But what if the shape is wrong? What if history doesn't move in a line at all? The ancient Hindus didn't think it did. They mapped time itself into vast cosmic cycles, the yugas, 4 great ages repeating in sequence like seasons on a scale that makes individual human lifespans feel like single heartbeats. The Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, where humanity lives in harmony with cosmic law, where knowledge flows freely, where lifespans stretch for thousands of years. Then the Treta Yuga, where virtue begins to slip. Then the Dvapara Yuga, where darkness and light stand in uneasy balance. And finally, the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, the age of forgetting, the age of strife, the age we happen to be living in right now, where the connection between human consciousness and higher wisdom is at its thinnest, where institutions corrupt and collapse, where the very concept of truth becomes contested. When the Kali Yuga ends, it doesn't graduate into something higher. It ends in catastrophe, a reset, and the cycle begins again with a new golden age built on the ashes of everything that came before. The Greeks had their own version, 5 ages of man, descending from perfection. Hesiod wrote about it nearly 3,000 years ago, describing the people of the Iron Age, his own era, with words that feel almost plagiarized from a modern newsfeed. Fathers turning against sons, honor dying, might making right, the unraveling of social bonds. He was describing the 8th century BCE, but read it today, and you'd swear he was describing something you saw this morning. What's astonishing, what should give you pause, is how many cultures developed this idea independently of each other. The Maya tracked vast cycles of creation and destruction with a mathematical precision that still makes astronomers uncomfortable. The Aztecs believed they were living in the 5th sun, the 5th world, with 4 previous humanities already destroyed by flood, wind, fire, and earth. Norse mythology predicted Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, followed by rebirth. Egyptian texts spoke of cycles governed by cosmic forces beyond human control, cycles measured not in centuries, but in tens of thousands of years. These weren't primitive peoples making up campfire stories. These were sophisticated civilizations with advanced astronomy, complex mathematics, monumental architecture. They were telling us something they believed with profound conviction. That we've been here before. That we'll be here again. That the wheel keeps turning whether we acknowledge it or not. And now, modern science has accidentally stumbled into the same territory from a completely different direction. In 2018, 2 researchers, a geologist and an astrobiologist, published what they called the Silurian hypothesis. The name is a reference to a Doctor Who episode about intelligent reptiles, but the science behind it is entirely serious. The question they asked was deceptively simple. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, would we even be able to find it? Think about what that question actually requires you to consider. Plate tectonics recycle the Earth's crust completely every few 100 million years. Erosion scrubs rock surfaces clean over geological timescales. Even our most permanent human-made structures, reinforced concrete, tempered steel, borosilicate glass, would decompose into chemically unremarkable components within a few million years. A city built by an industrial civilization 65 million years ago would now be, at most, a thin, anomalous layer in a sediment core, an unusual spike in certain isotopes, a brief chemical whisper in the rock record, easily dismissed as a local geological oddity. We wouldn't find their cities, we wouldn't find their roads, we wouldn't find their machines, we wouldn't even find their bones in any recognizable form. We'd find almost nothing, which means that absence of evidence is very far from evidence of absence. And the question of whether something came before us, not aliens, not gods, just humans or human-adjacent intelligence, arising earlier in Earth's long history, is a question that geology alone cannot definitively answer. The cycle theorists look at this and say, of course we can't find them. You can't find what's been ground to dust by time, but that doesn't mean they weren't there. Hold that thought, because the evidence we're about to look at doesn't come from millions of years ago. It comes from much closer, close enough that traces remain, if you know where to look, And if you're willing to look in places, the official timeline tells you to ignore. The story of the first lost civilization begins, of all places, with a lemur. It's 1864. A British zoologist named Philip Sclater is staring at a distribution map and trying to solve a problem that's been irritating naturalists for years. Lemurs, those wide-eyed, long-tailed primates that look like they were designed by a committee working from conflicting instructions, live primarily in Madagascar. Fine. Island ecosystems produce strange endemics. No surprise there. But lemur fossils also keep turning up in India. And that's a problem, because there's an entire ocean between India and Madagascar, with no known land bridge connecting them at any point in recorded geological history. Sclater stares at his map. He looks at the ocean between them. He does what scientists do when the data doesn't fit the known framework. He invents a new framework. What if there was once a continent there? A massive landmass spanning the Indian Ocean, providing a pathway for lemur ancestors before it sank beneath the waves. He names this hypothetical continent Lemuria, after the very animal whose distribution it's meant to explain. For a brief period, mainstream science takes the idea seriously. The theory of plate tectonics is still a century away. Scientists are still trying to figure out how continents and oceans work. The idea has a certain elegant logic. If mountains can rise from nothing, why can't continents sink into nothing? Then the spiritualists got hold of it. By the 1880s, Lemuria has been transformed from a zoological hypothesis into something far stranger. Madame Blavatsky, founder of Theosophy and arguably the most influential occultist of the 19th century, incorporates it into her elaborate cosmology of human spiritual evolution. In her telling, Lemuria wasn't just a continent. It was home to the third root race of humanity, beings who existed millions of years ago. 7 feet tall, 4-armed, with a third eye at the back of their skulls, capable of perceiving dimensions invisible to ordinary human senses. Modern plate tectonics has definitively buried Sclater's original scientific hypothesis. Madagascar drifted from the African continent, carrying its unique cargo of primitive primates. The Indian Ocean has been mapped. Sonar has scanned the depths. There is no sunken continent hiding under the water between India and Madagascar. The geological case is closed. But here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because while Victorian scientists were debating phantom continents in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific was hiding something real, something that the official timeline has been quietly struggling to explain ever since. It was 1985. A diving instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the waters off Yonaguni Island, the westernmost point of Japan, a small speck of land closer to Taiwan than to the Japanese mainland. He was looking for hammerhead sharks, which congregate in these waters. What he found instead was something that has generated more scientific controversy per square meter than almost any other underwater site on Earth. At a depth of about 100 feet, he came across what appeared to be a massive stone structure. Not a single, unusual rock formation. A complex. Terraces rising in regular steps, platforms with sharp, right-angled corners, channels carved through solid stone in perfectly straight lines, pillars, what looked unmistakably like staircases with consistent, measured risers, and looming above it all, a formation that several researchers have described as resembling a stepped pyramid, oriented toward the horizon in a way that looks deliberate rather than accidental. The site is roughly 150 meters wide and 40 meters tall. The main structure appears to be a single piece of bedrock, not assembled from separate blocks, but carved from the living rock of the seafloor. The scientific community has been split ever since. On one side, geologists who argue the formations are entirely natural. Yonaguni's geology is characterized by parallel layers of mudstone and sandstone that fracture along straight planes, a property called jointing. Erosion, wave action, and tectonic activity over millennia could plausibly create features that superficially resemble artificial construction. Human pattern recognition is extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily prone to false positives. We see faces in clouds and meaning in noise. We see architecture in geology. On the other side, marine geologist Professor Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus, who spent more than 15 years diving at Yonaguni before presenting his findings at international conferences. Kimura doesn't claim the entire site is artificial. He claims that natural rock formations have been modified, shaped, carved, extended by human hands. He points to what appear to be tool marks on certain surfaces, to holes drilled at angles that erosion couldn't account for, to the arrangement of fallen blocks that suggests deliberate demolition or manipulation rather than random collapse, to carvings on certain faces that look, uncomfortably, like representations of animals and human figures. Here's the number that makes this argument matter. If these structures were shaped by human hands, if even a portion of them were deliberately modified, they would have to have been worked when they were above water. And based on sea level records for the region, that means at minimum 10,000 years ago. Quite possibly 12,000, perhaps older. That would make Yonaguni older than the pyramids of Egypt by several thousand years. Older than Stonehenge. Older than any accepted advanced civilization by a considerable margin. It would place its construction squarely in a period when, according to the mainstream timeline, the people of the Western Pacific were hunter-gatherers without the knowledge, organization, or motivation to undertake monumental construction. And Yonaguni is not an isolated anomaly. Similar underwater formations have been documented off the coasts of Okinawa, near Taiwan, around certain Micronesian islands, all of them at depths that correspond with uncomfortable precision to coastlines that would have been exposed during the last ice age, when global sea levels were more than 300 feet lower than today. We have barely explored the continental shelves, the shallow underwater zones where Ice Age humans would have lived, where coastal settlements would have been built, where harbors would have been constructed, are largely unmapped and almost entirely unexcavated. Now consider what we do know with certainty. Humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago. This required crossing stretches of open water even at the lowest Ice Age sea levels. Someone built seaworthy vessels, developed navigation systems capable of crossing open ocean, and successfully colonized an entire continent. The ancestors of Polynesian peoples crossed thousands of miles of open Pacific without compasses or charts. guided solely by their knowledge of stars, ocean currents, and wave patterns, settling islands across an area larger than the continental United States. These were not simple people. These were maritime civilizations of extraordinary sophistication. And the question is, what did they build in the fertile coastal lowlands that are now 100 meters underwater during the 10,000 years when sea levels were low enough to expose vast stretches of land that are now permanently submerged? We don't know. We can't know, with current technology and current funding priorities for underwater archaeology. But the possibility, and it is a serious scientific possibility, not fringe speculation, is that entire civilizations flourished along Ice Age coastlines and were drowned when the glaciers melted and the seas rose. Their buildings submerged, their harbors flooded, their histories preserved only in the oral traditions of the descendants who survived. And those oral traditions exist. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific have been telling stories about drowned lands for as long as anyone has been recording such things. Hawaiian legends speak of an ancestral homeland lost to the ocean. Maori traditions in New Zealand reference Hawaii, a place of origin, a land of ancestors, a home that now lies beneath the waves. The mythology of cultures from Micronesia to Polynesia to Melanesia is saturated with memories of catastrophic floods, of islands that sank, of coastal homelands swallowed by a rising sea. Open Loop 1. Something else was found at the bottom of the Pacific, not at Yonaguni, but close. An object that the mainstream timeline has no explanation for. An object that suggests whoever built those underwater terraces was doing something far more sophisticated than stacking stones. We'll come back to that before the end. For now, hold the image of Yonaguni in your mind. Those terraces, those right angles, those impossible staircases at the bottom of the Pacific. And ask yourself, if Lemuria, in any form, ever existed, it wouldn't have been the tropical continent of 19th century fantasy. It would have been something more mundane and more extraordinary at the same time. A network of coastal cultures settled along shores that no longer exist, building in stone because stone lasts, navigating oceans because the ocean was their highway, watching the waters slowly rise around them across generations until the last of their coastline disappeared beneath the surface, and all that remained were the stories. Every lost civilization theory eventually has to reckon with Atlantis, not because Atlantis is the most credible of the ancient legends, but because it comes to us from a source that cannot be easily dismissed. Plato was not a tabloid journalist. He was not a mythologist, not a priest, not a spinner of popular entertainment. He was one of the most rigorous analytical thinkers in the history of Western philosophy. His dialogues on politics, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics form the backbone of the Western intellectual tradition. Universities still teach him as primary source material. The logic he developed, the questions he asked, the frameworks he built, they're still in use, still contested, still relevant more than 2,000 years after his death. And in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE, Plato describes Atlantis not as metaphor, not as parable, not as a thought experiment, but as history, documented history. A real place, a real civilization, a real destruction, transmitted to him through a chain of testimony he traces precisely, from the Egyptian priests of Sais to the Athenian statesman Solon, who visited them around 590 BCE, through 3 generations of Solon's family, and finally to Plato himself. He is meticulous about the details in a way that feels very unlike myth-making and very much like reportage. Atlantis, he says, lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. It was, he specifies, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. A continent-scale landmass, not an island. At its center was a capital city of extraordinary engineering, concentric rings of water and land alternating in a perfect target pattern, with channels cut through the rings to allow sea access, the whole system fed by natural springs that provided running hot and cold water to every district of the city. The outermost ring of water was 3 stades wide, roughly 600 feet. The rings of land between the waterways were proportionally greater. The entire capital sat within a vast plain 3,000 stades in one direction and 2,000 in the other. The walls of the city were sheathed in metals, brass on the outer wall, tin on the middle, and orichalcum, a mysterious material he describes as gleaming like fire, on the innermost ring surrounding the central citadel. They had, he tells us, a navy of 1,200 ships, an army capable of fielding tens of thousands of chariots, influence extending across the Atlantic and deep into the Mediterranean, with territorial control reaching as far as Egypt and what is now Tuscany. This wasn't a primitive culture. This was an empire, and for thousands of years, according to Plato, it was a relatively just one. The early Atlanteans valued wisdom over wealth. They preserved their original divine nature. They were, in his telling, descended from Poseidon, god of the sea, and a mortal woman named Cleito, and governed with genuine virtue. 10 kings, descended from Poseidon's 10 sons, met regularly at the great central temple to reaffirm their laws and their allegiance to each other. Then things changed. Slowly, across generations, the divine nature faded. The mortal nature grew, and with it came all the familiar corruptions of power. The Atlanteans began to want more than they had. They valued conquest over governance, expansion over wisdom, domination over cooperation. They looked at the civilizations of the Mediterranean and saw weakness. They launched their fleet. Their target was Athens. Not the Athens of the classical period, Plato is careful to note. An Athens that existed 9,000 years before his own time. A proto-Athens that he describes, with perhaps convenient specificity, as a society organized along the exact lines he would later outline in his Republic. Warrior philosophers, guardians of civilization, a city that embodied the virtues that Atlantis had abandoned. Somehow, impossibly, given the scale of the Atlantean navy, the Proto-Athenians held. And then the gods intervened. Zeus, looking down at what Atlantis had become, called the gods to council. Judgment was passed, and in a single day and night of catastrophic floods and earthquakes, the entire continent of Atlantis was swallowed by the ocean. Everything, every building, every ship, every archive, every person, gone. And the sea above where it had stood became unnavigable, choked with mud and debris for generations afterward. Now, Here is where Plato's story collides with something that geologists discovered more than 2,000 years after he wrote it. Around 11,600 years ago, precisely the time frame Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis, the Earth experienced one of the most dramatic and rapid climate transitions in the past 100,000 years. The Younger Dryas period ended. For context, the Younger Dryas was a sudden, severe cold reversal that interrupted the warming trend at the end of the last ice age. For about 1,300 years, roughly from 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, global temperatures plummeted back toward glacial conditions in what appears to have been a geologically instantaneous reversal. Ice sheets that had been retreating for thousands of years suddenly re-advanced. Massive megafauna species went extinct across multiple continents in a remarkably compressed timeframe. Human cultures that had been developing across the northern hemisphere appear to have experienced severe disruption or complete collapse. And then, around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended. Temperatures shot back up. The ice sheets that had recovered partially during the cold snap collapsed with extraordinary speed, and sea levels, which had already been rising since the end of the glacial maximum, surged. The meltwater pulses that followed were not gentle. Glacial lakes that had been dammed by ice sheets suddenly breached their barriers and released walls of fresh water into the world's oceans. In North America alone, the catastrophic drainage of what geologists call Lake Agassiz, a proglacial lake larger than the modern Caspian Sea, discharged enough fresh water into the North Atlantic to potentially disrupt the global ocean circulation patterns that regulate climate across the entire northern hemisphere. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years disappeared under rising seas within a few generations. Entire river valleys were drowned. Lowland settlements were overwhelmed. A people who had lived on coastal plains for countless generations suddenly found their homes underwater, their fishing grounds gone, their agricultural land beneath the surf. To the people living through it, it would not have felt like geology. It would have felt like the end of the world. It would have felt exactly like what Plato described. Plato insisted his account was history, not allegory. His student Aristotle apparently thought he'd invented it for philosophical purposes, and for 2 millennia, the Aristotelian interpretation was the mainstream one. But the more we understand about what the Earth was doing 11,600 years ago, the more uncomfortably specific Plato's timeline becomes. Where was Atlantis? The honest answer is, we don't know. Some researchers point to the Richat structure, a giant circular geological formation in Mauritania that, seen from above, bears an eerie resemblance to Plato's concentric ring description. Others focus on the shallow shelves of the Atlantic Ocean itself, now covered by hundreds of feet of water. Some propose the Aegean, some propose Antarctica. None of these hypotheses has achieved anything approaching scientific consensus, but this much is not in dispute. The catastrophes Plato described were real. The sea level rises were real. The geological upheaval was real. The destruction of coastal civilizations across the planet around 11,600 years ago was real. Whether Atlantis was a specific place or an echo of multiple disasters compressed into a single legend. The truth behind the story is written in sediment cores and ocean floor bathymetry. The question isn't whether something terrible happened 11,600 years ago. The question is what we lost when it did. The Greeks had a word for paradise, Hyperborea, the land beyond Boreas, beyond the north wind, beyond the frozen breath that swept down from the top of the world. And in their oldest and most consistent stories, Hyperborea was not a metaphysical realm. It was not the Elysian Fields, not Olympus, not some divine dimension inaccessible to mortal feet. It was a place, a real, physical, terrestrial place, located, the Greeks were quite specific about this, at the far north. And it was not cold. According to Pindar, Herodotus, Hecataeus of Abdera, and other ancient Greek writers who treated the subject with enough seriousness to be worth quoting on other matters, Hyperborea was temperate, warm, abundantly fertile. The sun shone there for 6 months continuously, which is, of course, literally true at the Arctic in summer, as any basic understanding of Earth's axial tilt would predict. The people of Hyperborea were human, not gods. Humans, extraordinarily long-lived, who had built a society of such stability and happiness that even the Olympian gods were said to visit regularly for rest and renewal. Apollo, the god of light, order, reason, prophecy, and music, maintained a particular connection to Hyperborea. The stories say he retreated there every winter, spending the dark months among the Hyperboreans before returning south with the spring. His primary oracle at Delos was said to have been established with the help of sacred gifts transmitted from Hyperborea, passed from tribe to tribe, across thousands of miles until they reached the Aegean. The Greeks insisted the Hyperboreans were real, not symbolic, not aspirational metaphors. Real people, living in a real place, at or near the top of the world. Now, any rational 21st century reader will immediately raise the obvious objection. The Arctic Circle is not, and has never been, at least within any conceivable time frame of human civilization, a temperate paradise. It is frozen. It is harsh. It is one of the least hospitable environments on Earth for complex human settlement. And yet, here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. In 1569, the Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator, one of the most brilliant mapmakers in history, the man whose projection system still defines how we represent the spherical Earth on flat paper, published a map that includes something remarkable at the North Pole. Not blank space, not vague speculation. A specific geographic feature. 4 large islands surrounding an open polar sea, with a massive mountain at the center from which 4 rivers flow outward, dividing the polar region into quadrants. Where did he get this? Mercator claimed he was copying from older sources, much older sources, a document he called the Inventio Fortunata, a now lost 14th century text that itself claimed to be based on even more ancient geographical knowledge. In 1595, his son Romuald Mercator published an updated version of the map. The polar configuration remained, and this map, showing a structured, specific, non-icy landscape at the North Pole, was produced more than 3 centuries before anyone had come close to actually exploring the Arctic. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows something equally disorienting. A southern continent, labeled Terra Australis, with coastlines and river systems that bear a disturbing resemblance to the actual geography of Antarctica, including features of the coastline that lie beneath a kilometer of ice and were unknown to modern science until radar surveys were conducted in the 20th century. To map something accurately, you need to have observed it. To observe a coastline buried under a kilometer of ice, you need either modern geophysical technology or access to that coastline before the ice covered it, which, for Antarctica, means at minimum 10 to 15,000 years ago. The mainstream explanation is that Renaissance cartographers were filling blank spaces with imagination, extrapolating from limited data, drawing symmetrical land masses because the concept of a balanced Earth was philosophically appealing. It's a reasonable explanation. It may even be correct, but consider what it requires you to assume: that cartographers working with limited information, using artistic and philosophical frameworks rather than actual data, happened by accident to produce configurations that match geological features only confirmed by 20th century radar surveys under polar ice. The odds of that kind of accidental accuracy across multiple independent maps from multiple cartographers are worth examining carefully. Some researchers, not fringe theorists, but credentialed scientists working in fields from geology to climatology, have proposed a mechanism that would explain both the maps and the Greek legends. It's called crustal displacement. The idea, developed most completely by Charles Hapgood in the 1950s, is that Earth's outer crust is capable of slipping over the inner layers of the planet, not slowly, through the plate tectonic process we now understand well, but in rapid, catastrophic lurches, driven by the accumulated weight of growing ice sheets destabilizing the rotational balance of the planet. If the crust shifted, regions that were once at temperate latitudes could find themselves at the poles. Former polar regions could slide toward more moderate climates. Ice sheets that had built up over thousands of years in one location could suddenly melt because they'd moved to a warmer latitude, causing sea levels to rise catastrophically. Mainstream geoscience does not accept Hapgood's mechanism as described. The physics are problematic. Plate tectonics explains crustal movement far more convincingly. But the idea has never been entirely dismissed, in part because it would explain so much that currently lacks explanation. The flash-frozen mammoths of Siberia, found with undigested temperate climate vegetation still in their stomachs, as though they were eating grass in a temperate meadow and frozen solid before they could swallow. The temperate forests buried under Antarctic ice, and those maps showing ice-free polar coastlines. Albert Einstein, notably, found the hypothesis interesting enough to write a foreword to Hapgood's book in 1953. He didn't endorse it, but he considered it worth taking seriously. If something like crustal displacement happened, triggered perhaps by the same comet or asteroid impact event that many researchers now believe ended the Younger Dryas, then Hyperborea might not be mythology at all. It might be memory, a genuine recollection, distorted and allegorized across thousands of years of oral transmission, of a time when the region now locked under Arctic ice was warm, fertile, and inhabited by a culture sophisticated enough to impress Greek writers who had access to what they believed were first-hand accounts. And when the catastrophe came, whether impact, displacement, climate reversal, or some combination of all three, Hyperborea would have had nowhere to go. No gradual adjustment, no time for adaptation, no generations of slow displacement. The cold would have come like a door slamming. The paradise would have become a tomb. And the survivors, if any survived, would have carried south a memory so vivid, so overwhelming, so impossible to fully explain, that even thousands of years later, the Greeks were still writing about it with the certainty of documented fact. The story of Mu begins not with a philosopher or a mystic, but with a British Army colonel stationed in India in the 1870s. James Churchward was, by all accounts, a practical man, an engineer, a military officer, not someone you'd expect to spend the last decades of his life obsessively reconstructing the history of a lost continent from ancient clay tablets. And yet, according to Churchward, a Hindu priest at a temple in southern India showed him something extraordinary, a collection of ancient tablets written in a language so old that only a handful of scholarly priests could still decipher it, the language of the Nakal, a priestly brotherhood that claimed direct lineage from a civilization that predated anything in the accepted historical record. The priest agreed to teach Churchward this dead language. And what Churchward extracted from those tablets, if they existed, and we should hold that conditional firmly in mind, rewrote the human story from the beginning. Mu, according to his translations, was not a minor civilization. It was the first, the source, the motherland from which all subsequent civilizations descended, directly or through colonial lineages. It occupied the Pacific, not the Indian Ocean, not the Atlantic, the vast, largely unmapped Pacific, stretching from somewhere north of Hawaii, down past Easter Island, and west toward the Philippines. A continent, Churchward claimed, roughly the size of South America, and on this continent, a population of 64 million people. Writing, mathematics, astronomy sophisticated enough to produce accurate celestial calendars, navigation systems that allowed them to cross thousands of miles of open ocean, cities with populations in the millions. Most critically, Churchward argued that every major ancient civilization we know, Egypt, India, Babylon, the Maya, were either direct colonies of Mu or civilizations that had absorbed Mu's refugees and inherited fragments of Mu's knowledge. The pyramids of Egypt derived from Mu. The astronomical precision of the Maya inherited from Mu. The Vedic texts of India, transcribed from Mu's original records. Mu, he claimed, was destroyed in a single catastrophic event, massive volcanic eruptions and earthquakes triggered by the collapse of gas chambers beneath the continent, which sent the entire landmass sliding beneath the Pacific roughly 12,000 years ago. Simultaneously with Atlantis's destruction. Simultaneously with the Younger Dryas transition. Now, Churchward never produced the tablets. He never allowed other scholars to examine them. He published his findings starting in 1926, when he was nearly 80 years old, in a series of books that sold widely and influenced alternative history deeply, but convinced mainstream archaeology of precisely nothing. Geology has confirmed that no continent has sunk beneath the Pacific within any time frame relevant to human civilization. The Pacific floor has been mapped. Mu, as Churchward described it, did not exist. And yet, the physical anomalies he pointed to as evidence of Mu's existence remain unexplained. Easter Island sits alone in the eastern Pacific, over 1,000 miles from the nearest inhabited land, separated from the South American coast by 2,300 miles of open ocean. And yet, the people who settled this tiny, resource-poor island managed, over many centuries, to carve and erect 887 stone statues, the moai, some of them nearly 70 feet tall, the largest weighing over 80 tons. They built sophisticated platforms, ahu, along the coastline as bases for the statues. They developed one of the only independent writing systems in the Pacific, Rongo-Rongo, a script that has never been fully deciphered. How? How does a small, isolated island population develop the organizational complexity, the engineering knowledge, and the motivated commitment to undertake this scale of monumental construction? The conventional explanation, gradual development of local techniques over generations, is plausible, but it raises as many questions as it answers. Far more inexplicable is Nan Madol. Off the eastern coast of the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, built on a coral reef in open water, is an artificial archipelago of 92 constructed islets connected by a network of tidal canals. The structures on these islets were built from basalt, a volcanic rock found nowhere on the reef itself, in massive prismatic logs, some weighing several tons each, stacked in alternating perpendicular layers like enormous Lincoln logs. The total volume of basalt used in the construction is estimated at 750,000 metric tons. No one knows how they got there. The nearest basalt deposits are on the main island of Pohnpei, miles away. Floating the stones by raft across open water is one proposed explanation. Local legend says twin sorcerers levitated the stones with magic. The architectural style: massive interlocking basalt logs, no mortar, a complex drainage engineering, sophisticated urban planning extending across 83 acres of open ocean, has no clear parallel anywhere in the Pacific. It suggests a building tradition that either developed in extraordinary isolation or descends from a common ancestor that has not been identified. The Ha'amonga, a Maui in Tonga, a massive stone trilithon, 3 coral limestone slabs each weighing between 30 and 40 tons, arranged like a doorway, stands without obvious context in the Tongan landscape. No nearby quarry, no obvious construction sequence that explains how the lintel was lifted into place. Local tradition says it marks a portal to ancestral homelands in the West. And then there are the linguistic and mythological patterns. Across the Pacific, from Hawaii to New Zealand, from Micronesia to the Marquesas, indigenous cultures preserve stories of ancestral homelands that sank, not coastlines that eroded, not islands that were abandoned, lands that went underwater. The Hawaiian concept of kahiki, a distant homeland across the sea. The Maori concept of Hawaii, a place of origin from which the ancestors voyaged and to which the spirits of the dead return. Maybe all of this is convergent mythology, the natural product of seafaring cultures that are always moving, always leaving places behind, always conscious of the ocean's power to swallow land. Maybe the structural similarities in Pacific architecture across thousands of miles of open ocean reflect independent development of similar solutions to similar problems. Or maybe, and this is the possibility that the physical evidence refuses to entirely rule out, there was once something in the Pacific that provided a common source. Not a continent, perhaps. The geology won't support that. But a network, a maritime civilization of extraordinary sophistication that connected the Pacific Islands across thousands of miles, that built in stone because stone lasts, that was drowned, not all at once, but over centuries of rising seas as the Ice Age ended, and that left behind, scattered across the largest ocean on Earth, fragments of itself too massive to move and too anomalous to easily explain. If Mu was real, even a version of Mu, stripped of the 64 million people, and the psychic powers and the colonial empire, it would look almost exactly like what we find when we look carefully at the Pacific. Magnificent stone structures with no clear builder, oral traditions saturated with memories of drowned lands, an ocean full of islands that seem like they should be the tops of something larger, and 10,000 feet down, in the darkness of the Pacific floor, all the answers quietly out of reach. Before there were any of the civilizations we've discussed, before Lemuria, or Atlantis, or Hyperborea, or Mu, before any name we might give to a lost world, the oldest stories from the oldest cultures speak of something else entirely, not a civilization with a name and a geography and a set of architectural achievements, something older and stranger, a different order of reality, a world before the water came, the antediluvian world, the world before the flood. The flood myth is the most universally distributed narrative in all of human folklore, not just common, universal. You can find it on every inhabited continent, in cultures that had no known contact with each other until modern times, in traditions so old that the specific details had been filtered through thousands of years of oral transmission before anyone thought to write them down. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, among the oldest pieces of literature in existence, composed in Sumer around 2100 BCE, but based on stories far older, tells of a man named Utnapishtim who is warned by the gods that a flood is coming. He builds a massive boat. He loads it with his family, craftspeople, and the seeds of all living things. The flood comes. It is total, world-ending. When it recedes, the boat rests on a mountain. A dove is released to find dry land. A sacrifice is offered. A new world begins. The parallels to the biblical Noah story are exact enough to constitute clear cultural transmission. Someone was borrowing from someone, or both were borrowing from something older. But the same structure appears in India, where Vishnu appears as a divine fish to warn the Soj Manu of an approaching deluge, instructing him to build a vessel that the fish will tow to safety. In Greece, where Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a world-destroying flood sent by Zeus. In ancient China, where legendary heroes struggle to control waters that have drowned the land. In the Americas, where Aztec cosmology describes the current world as the fifth sun, the fourth having been destroyed by flood. In Polynesia, in the highlands of Ethiopia, in the Andes, where stories of a great water that swallowed the valleys survive in cultures that live thousands of miles from any ocean. Some of these stories are almost certainly memories of local catastrophic floods. Rivers overflow, tsunamis strike, or coasts erode. These events, devastating to the people experiencing them, get amplified in the retelling over generations into world-scale events. This is a well-understood process of mythological inflation, but some of these stories are something else. When a culture at high altitude, with no coastal exposure, with no access to ocean-scale phenomena, preserves a story of a world-drowning flood. A flood that covered not just local geography, but everything, every mountain, every valley, the entire known world. The mythological inflation explanation requires considerable stretching. What are the Andean highlanders inflating? What coastal event, magnified by generations of retelling, produces a story about a flood that covered the Andes? The more plausible explanation, in at least some of these cases, is that the story isn't an inflation of a local event. It's a memory, distorted, allegorized, filtered through the narrative frameworks of each specific culture, of a real global phenomenon. And we know there was a real global phenomenon. As the last ice age ended, between roughly 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by more than 120 meters, not slowly and evenly, in pulses, sometimes very rapid pulses. Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,500 years ago, appears to have raised global sea levels by as much as 20 meters in roughly 500 years, a rate of 4 centimeters per year, which sounds modest until you consider what it means for people living on flat coastal plains. In a generation, your shoreline might move miles inland. In a lifetime, entire river valleys disappear. To the people living through this, it was a flood. An ongoing, relentless, civilization-ending flood that lasted for millennia. Not 40 days, not 40 years, generations. The shoreline kept eating the land, and it never stopped. Any coastal civilization that existed during this period, and coastlines are where complex human cultures develop, where agriculture begins, where trade networks form, where cities arise, would have been progressively overwhelmed. Each generation abandoning a little more land. Each generation telling their children about the places the sea had swallowed since their grandparents' time. And the antediluvian people, the people of the world before the flood. Who were they? The ancient texts are tantalizingly, infuriatingly specific in some ways, and utterly obscure in others. The Book of Genesis, sandwiched between the genealogies and before the flood account, mentions the Nephilim. The exact translation of the word is disputed. It may mean fallen ones or giants, depending on the interpretive tradition. But the context is strange. They are described as the offspring of the sons of God and human women. They are described as mighty men of old, men of renown, and they are described as existing before the flood, as part of the world that the flood destroyed. Similar figures appear independently across multiple ancient traditions. Greek mythology populates the pre-Olympian world with titans and giants, beings of enormous power who preceded the current order, who shaped the landscape, who were eventually overcome, but never entirely erased. Norse tradition speaks of Jötnar, frost giants, primeval beings who existed before the current world was formed. In parts of North America, indigenous traditions speak of giant ancestors, some helpful and some terrible, who lived in the time before the great changes came. The consistent global pattern of stories about large, powerful, pre-flood beings is hard to dismiss, but hard to interpret correctly is equally difficult. Are these symbolic representations giant as a metaphor for the scale of ancestral power and achievement viewed through the distorting lens of cultural memory? Are they exaggerated accounts of large human individuals? Are they garbled memories of contact with archaic human species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, who might have been sufficiently different in appearance and capability to be remembered as semi-mythological? We don't know. What we know is that the pattern exists, that it's global, that it's ancient, and that it clusters consistently around the concept of a world before the water changed everything. The antediluvian world, whatever it actually was, had its own sciences, its own architecture, its own ways of organizing human knowledge. When the seas rose, much of that was destroyed. Not all at once, the process took thousands of years, but inevitably, progressively, completely. The coastal settlements went first, then the river valleys, then the lowland plains. The knowledge stored in those settlements, agricultural techniques, navigational methods, architectural engineering, astronomical calendars, whatever body of accumulated understanding had developed over tens of thousands of years of human civilization along the Ice Age coastlines, went with them. What survived was what the refugees carried in their heads. And what people carry in their heads, transmitted verbally across generation after generation, becomes myth, becomes religion, becomes legend about giants and divine beings and worlds before the flood. What we're left with is a ghost, a world-shaped absence in the archaeological record. The place where all that knowledge should be, hollowed out by 120 meters of risen ocean. Pattern interrupt. Shift to scientific grounding before returning to mystery. Sometime around 12,000 years ago, right at the boundary of the Younger Dryas and the beginning of what we call the Holocene, something happened to human stone. For hundreds of thousands of years before, stone was a tool, a practical object. You picked it up, you shaped one edge into something that cut, or scraped or smashed. You used it until it broke, and you picked up another one. Stone was instrumental, utilitarian, interchangeable. And then, seemingly almost overnight on the geological timescale, stones start moving. Not pebbles, not hand-sized flakes, not the kind of stone you could manage with two people and a rope. Monsters. Blocks weighing dozens of tons, then hundreds of tons. Transported over distances that defy easy explanation. Fitted together with tolerances that challenge modern engineering. Oriented to celestial phenomena with a precision that required sophisticated astronomical observation. Arranged in patterns that encode mathematical relationships not rediscovered by Western science until millennia later. Something changed, and whatever changed left traces on every continent on Earth. Start with the most famous, the Great Pyramid of Giza. You've seen the pictures. You think you understand the scale. You don't, not until you're standing at the base of it, watching your mind refuse to process what your eyes are seeing. Its base covers 13.6 acres. Each side is 756 feet long, and across that entire length, across the accumulated mass of 2.3 million stone blocks averaging 2.5 tons each. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters. Not approximately level. Not mostly level. 2.1 centimeters across 13.6 acres of desert. Modern construction crews with laser levels and GPS would struggle to match that. The four sides of the pyramid are aligned to the four cardinal directions: true north, true south, true east, true west, with an accuracy of less than 4 minutes of arc. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height approximates 2 pi, as though someone folded a circle into a square. The internal shafts point to specific stars: Orion's belt, Thuban in Draco, Sirius, as they appeared from Egypt's latitude at a specific historical moment. The mainstream explanation, and it's a serious explanation supported by considerable evidence, is that the pyramid was built by a large, organized workforce using sophisticated but entirely pre-industrial techniques. Sledges, ramps, levers, ropes, and the organizational genius of the Old Kingdom Egyptian state. The astronomical alignments were achieved through careful celestial observation. This explanation may be entirely correct. The Egyptian state of 2500 BCE was capable of extraordinary engineering achievements, but it stops being fully satisfying when you look at what's underneath the pyramid. The bedrock on which it sits shows signs of modification that some geologists argue predate the Old Kingdom by a considerable margin. The Sphinx enclosure shows a pattern of erosion on its walls that geologist Robert Schoch argues was caused by rainfall, not wind and sand. The last time Egypt had sufficient rainfall to cause that kind of erosion was before 5000 BCE. Possibly well before. If Schoch is right, and his analysis is disputed, but not refuted, the Sphinx, or at least the enclosure it sits in, is significantly older than Egyptology currently accepts, which means something was happening at Giza before the Old Kingdom, something we don't have a good explanation for. Now cross the Atlantic. High in the Andes, overlooking Cusco, the fortress temple complex of Sacsayhuaman grips a hillside with walls that stop experienced stonecutters cold. The blocks are not uniform. They're wildly irregular, polygonal stones with anywhere from 4 to 20 faces, each one different, each one fitting against its neighbors with seamless precision. The tolerances are so tight that you cannot slide a sheet of paper into the joints. No mortar, no filler, just stone against stone. We're fitted with such accuracy that after 500 years of Andean seismicity, earthquakes that have repeatedly devastated the colonial Spanish buildings nearby, the walls of Sacsayhuaman haven't shifted. The largest blocks weigh over 100 tons. The quarry from which they came is miles away, across a river valley, and up a significant elevation change. The Inca, who occupied the site when the Spanish arrived, told their conquerors that they had not built the largest stones, that those had been placed by a previous people, a race of giants in some tellings, before the Inca arrived. At Pumapunku, near Lake Titicaca, the mystery takes a different form. Here, the stones are not enormous fitted polygons. They are machined. That's the only word that fits. Blocks of andesite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, cut with right angles so precise, with channels so perfectly regular, with interlocking shapes so complex that engineers who have examined them struggle to explain how they were achieved without metal tools and precision measurement equipment far beyond what is presumed to have existed at the site's estimated date of construction. But the site that scrambles the timeline most completely is in Turkey. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hilltop in southeastern Anatolia. What he found over the next 2 decades has never been fully incorporated into the standard narrative of human prehistory, because it breaks that narrative in a place that cannot be easily repaired. Göbekli Tepe, a complex of stone circles, each one containing carved T-shaped pillars between 2 and 6 meters tall, weighing between 10 and 20 tons each. The pillars are carved with detailed, sophisticated reliefs: foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, snakes, scorpions, and among them, abstract symbols that may constitute a pictographic system not yet deciphered. The oldest layers of the site have been dated to approximately 11,500 to 12,000 years ago. At that date, according to the standard timeline of human development, the people of Anatolia were hunter-gatherers, pre-agricultural, without permanent settlements, without social organization capable of sustained monumental construction, without the kind of specialized knowledge required to design, quarry, transport, and erect multi-ton carved stone pillars in geometric arrangements. Schmidt's conclusion, repeated before his death in 2014, was that Göbekli Tepe didn't fit the model of civilization we'd been working with. The monument didn't come after civilization. It may have preceded it. He also noted something that has received less attention than it deserves. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was buried, deliberately, intentionally filled with clean soil and stone, encasing the stone circles under several meters of carefully placed material, sealing them from the surface. Someone expended enormous labor not to build this monument, but to preserve it, to hide it, to protect it from something. What were they hiding it from? What were they protecting it against? We don't know. Schmidt didn't know. We're still excavating. Less than 5% of the site has been uncovered. But the picture that emerges when you stand back and look at Göbekli Tepe alongside Sacsayhuaman, alongside Pumapunku, alongside the Giza Plateau, alongside the megalithic temples of Malta, alongside Stonehenge, all of these sites, all of these techniques, all of this impossible precision is a picture of a tradition, not a single culture, not a single architect, not a single moment, but a tradition, a body of knowledge about how to work stone, how to align it to the sky, how to build for permanence rather than convenience, that appears across the entire planet in cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, in time periods that mainstream archaeology struggles to reconcile. What if the master builders weren't a specific civilization with a name and a flag and a capital city? What if they were the survivors? The people who carried forward, from the drowned world of the Younger Dryas transition, a body of knowledge about stone and sky and geometry, and taught it to whoever would listen, wherever they landed. The stones remain. The knowledge of who placed them and why, mostly gone, but the stones remain. If 6 civilizations rose before us, something ended each one, not the slow decline of overextended empires, not the gradual erosion of cultural memory across centuries. Something fast, something total, something that didn't just topple governments or bankrupt economies, but erased coastlines, extinguished species, and buried the physical evidence so thoroughly that 12,000 years later, we're still arguing about whether it happened. The universe has several instruments capable of that kind of destruction. We know this because we've found their fingerprints. The first instrument is the one most people think of first: rocks from space. Asteroids and comets move through the solar system on orbital paths, measured in hundreds of thousands of years. Most pass harmlessly by. Earth's cross-section is small relative to the volume of the solar system, and most of what crosses our path misses. But occasionally, with the patient indifference of physics, something intersects. When a large body, not a small meteor, but something of genuine mass, kilometers across, strikes Earth, the energy released is not measured in nuclear weapon equivalents. It's measured in thousands, sometimes millions of nuclear weapon equivalents. The shockwave travels faster than sound through the crust. The atmosphere is effectively on fire in the impact zone. Billions of tons of vaporized rock and soil are ejected into the upper atmosphere, spreading globally within days to weeks. Sunlight is blocked, temperatures plummet, photosynthesis slows, the food chain destabilizes from the bottom up. Species that survived everything else die because the sky is wrong. This happened 66 million years ago and ended the dinosaurs. It happened before that, repeatedly. It will happen again. The physics guarantee it. But the most relevant impact event, the one that sits at the center of the timeline we've been exploring all night, may not have happened 66 million years ago. It may have happened 12,800 years ago. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and if it's correct, it's the most important catastrophe in human history. The evidence, first assembled by a team of researchers led by James Kennett at UC Santa Barbara and published in 2007, centers on a thin sediment layer found at Younger Dryas boundary sites on 4 continents. In this layer, precisely at the geological moment when the Younger Dryas cold period began, researchers have found microscopic diamonds that only form under extreme heat and pressure. Magnetic spherules consistent with extraterrestrial impact, elevated concentrations of platinum, iridium, and osmium, elements rare in Earth's crust but common in certain types of extraterrestrial material, charcoal layers indicating continental scale fires, and nanodiamonds, hexagonal carbon structures not found in normal geological contexts, at multiple sites simultaneously, the hypothesis these researchers proposed. Around 12,800 years ago, a fragmented comet, not a single solid body, but a loose cluster of rocky and icy debris spread across a broad orbital band, intersected with Earth. Multiple fragments struck or airburst over the ice sheets covering North America and possibly over other regions. The impacts vaporized cubic miles of ice in microseconds. Superheated steam and impact debris were ejected into the atmosphere. Massive meltwater pulses flooded the world's oceans, disrupting ocean circulation patterns that regulate global climate. Continent-scale wildfires ignited under the impact plumes. The combined effect was a sudden, severe climate reversal. Not gradual cooling, but a rapid plunge into glacial conditions, followed 1,200 years later by an equally abrupt recovery. The debate within science has been vigorous. Some studies confirm the impact markers. Others argue they're the result of contamination, misidentification, or ordinary geological processes. The hypothesis is neither proven nor disproven. But the evidence keeps accumulating at sites around the world. In the sediments of Abu Huraira in Syria, in the lakes of South Africa, in the ice cores of Greenland, whispering the same thing from different locations. Something big happened 12,800 years ago. It happened fast, and if any civilization was flourishing at that moment, they would have had no warning and no refuge. But cosmic impact is only one of the universe's reset mechanisms. Supervolcanoes don't announce themselves with spectacular peaks and dramatic lava flows. They announce themselves by the absence of such things. They sit beneath flat plains and quiet lakes, building pressure over tens of thousands of years with geological patience. And then they release more energy in a single eruption than humanity has used in all of recorded history. Approximately 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in Sumatra erupted. Ash from this eruption has been found across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. Climate models suggest global temperatures may have dropped by several degrees Celsius on average. Growing seasons collapsed, plant productivity fell, animal populations crashed. Some geneticists have proposed that this eruption caused a human population bottleneck, a catastrophic reduction in the total human population to perhaps a few thousand individuals, a near-extinction event from which the entire current human species descends. The genetic evidence for this bottleneck is clear. The Toba connection is still debated, but the timing is suggestive. Yellowstone in North America, Campi Flegrei in Italy, Long Valley in California. These are active caldera systems, each capable of Toba-scale eruptions. Each one has erupted catastrophically in the geological past. Each one will erupt again. And then there are the destroyers we made ourselves. In 1859, a British astronomer named Richard Carrington observed something on the solar surface that no one had seen clearly before. A massive eruption of magnetized plasma, a coronal mass ejection of extraordinary scale. The plasma cloud arrived at Earth about 17 hours later. The result was the largest geomagnetic storm in recorded history. Auroras were visible as far south as Cuba and Honolulu. Telegraph systems across Europe and North America failed. Operators received electrical shocks from their equipment. Telegraph paper spontaneously ignited from the induced currents. This was in 1859. The total electrical infrastructure of human civilization in 1859 consisted of telegraph wires. Now consider what a Carrington-scale event would do to 2024 infrastructure. Global satellite networks, GPS systems, intercontinental power grids, internet backbone infrastructure, the entire digital nervous system of modern civilization, all of it exposed to induced electrical surges of a magnitude that fried copper telegraph wires in 1859. Engineers who have studied this scenario professionally estimate that a Carrington-equivalent storm today could fry high-voltage transformers across multiple continents. Transformers that take years to manufacture and cannot be quickly replaced. power grids that once failed cannot be restarted without external power. A cascading collapse of electrical infrastructure that could take months to years to restore in even the best-case scenario. Not the end of humanity, but potentially the end of our current civilization. The digital economy, gone. The global supply chains feeding billions of people, broken. The medical systems keeping the sick alive, failed. The financial systems, offline. The communications networks, dark. After such an event, a few hundred years of recovery. And what would a future archaeologist find? Corroded steel skeletons of cities, microplastics in sediment layers, a brief, anomalous spike in atmospheric carbon frozen in ice cores, and stone. Wherever we built in stone, the stone would remain. Exactly like what we find from the civilizations before us. Closing open loop 1, the object from the bottom of the Aegean, and what it tells us about what was found in the Pacific. Let me tell you about the object at the bottom of the Aegean. In 1901, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera, a tiny island in the channel between Crete and the Peloponnese, located a shipwreck from approximately the 1st century BCE. They raised bronze statues, marble fragments, pottery, coins, jewelry, standard cargo for an ancient Mediterranean trading vessel. They also raised a corroded lump of bronze and wood about the size of a large dictionary, which sat in a museum storeroom for years while the exciting finds got the attention. Then, in 1902, an archaeologist named Valerios Stais noticed something. The lump had gears inside it. Not a gear. Not 2 gears. A system of at least 30, subsequent X-ray and CT scanning has revealed the number to be higher, possibly over 70. Interlocking bronze gears, each tooth cut with mathematical precision, embedded in a wooden casing with multiple display dials on the front and back. Turn a crank on the side and the gears move. The dials turn, and they display astronomical information. The position of the sun and moon, the phases of the lunar cycle, the dates of upcoming solar and lunar eclipses, the positions of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, the cycle of Olympic Games. It is, in function, an analog computer, a mechanical model of the solar system, capable of predicting astronomical events years in advance, built from bronze gears manufactured to tolerances measured in tenths of a millimeter. The Antikythera mechanism was built approximately 2,100 years ago. According to the standard timeline of technological development, mechanisms of equivalent complexity do not appear again until the astronomical clocks of 14th century Europe, a gap of 1,400 years during which our species apparently forgot or never rediscovered how to make one. This is not disputed. This is not fringe theory. This is the consensus of the scientific community, which has spent decades studying the mechanism and arrived at a nearly unanimous position. It should not exist at the time it was made. Where did it come from? Some researchers have proposed that the mechanism was the product of a tradition of astronomical instrument making that has left no other physical survivors. Not because it didn't exist. How do you make one Antikythera mechanism without a tradition that produced it? But because the other instruments in that tradition were made of perishable materials or were lost in the fires and floods and conquests that periodically reset the knowledge base of ancient civilization. The Antikythera mechanism survived because it happened to be on a ship that happened to sink in water deep enough to preserve it from salvage, but shallow enough to be reached by sponge divers 2,000 years later. A lucky accident. The only window into an entire tradition of precision engineering that otherwise left no trace. If one object's survival by accident reveals a hidden tradition, a body of knowledge we had no evidence of before the ocean preserved it for us, how many other traditions are sitting undiscovered at the bottom of the world's oceans? How many other mechanisms? How many other instruments? How many other technologies did the ancient world produce that simply didn't have the luck to sink in the right depth of water? The Baghdad batteries compound the mystery from a different angle. In the 1930s, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König was working through the collections of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad when he came across a set of clay jars, approximately 2,000 years old, that had been found in the ruins of a Parthian village near Baghdad. Each jar contained a copper cylinder. Inside each cylinder, an iron rod. The iron and copper were separated by an asphalt stopper. The jars showed traces of an acidic substance, possibly grape juice or vinegar or some other organic acid. When König assembled a replica using a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and vinegar, he measured a current, approximately 1.1 volts. The objects are, in function, galvanic cells, batteries, crude ones, but functional. Wire several in series, and you have a battery pack capable of producing several volts, enough for practical electrochemical applications. Mainstream archaeology has pushed back on this interpretation for decades. The jars could have been used for storing organic material. The assembly of the elements might be coincidental. The absence of any ancient text describing electrical applications means we're reading an interpretation into a physical configuration that might have had a completely different purpose. But here's what makes the argument harder to dismiss than it might seem. Objects have been found in the ancient Middle East, figurines, pendants, decorative pieces that appear to bear gold and silver coatings applied by electroplating rather than any mechanical method. The coating is too thin and too uniform to have been hammered or applied as leaf. The penetration pattern into the base metal is consistent with electrochemical deposition rather than mechanical application. If ancient craftspeople were electroplating, they needed a current source. The Baghdad batteries, assembled and connected in series, could provide that current. We are not arguing that ancient Mesopotamia had light bulbs. We're arguing something far more modest, that an empirical understanding of galvanic chemistry, not a theoretical understanding, but a practical, craft-level knowledge that this configuration of materials produces an effect that can be used, may have existed 2,000 years ago and been lost. Lost not because it was impossible, lost because the people who knew it died, or their workshops burned, or the technique passed out of use in an economic collapse, or simply failed to get written down in a document that survived. This is the pattern that runs through every out-of-place artifact, not science fiction technology, not alien engineering, not magic, just human ingenuity, periodically reaching levels of sophistication that the official timeline doesn't account for, and periodically being erased by the same catastrophes that erase everything else, not gradually forgetting, violently, suddenly, completely losing. And then the elongated skulls in burial sites across the world: Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, Egypt, Malta, the Crimea, Siberia. Archaeologists have found skulls with unusual shapes, elongated, high, not in the normal range of human cranial variation. In many cases, clearly the result of intentional cranial deformation, a practice documented in dozens of cultures around the world, where the skulls of infants are bound with cloth or boards to reshape them during the years when the bones are still flexible. But some of these skulls are different. The bone structure is wrong for artificial deformation. The cranial sutures, the seams where the skull bones join together, don't match normal human anatomy. In normal human skulls, the parietal bones are separated by a parietal suture running front to back. In certain elongated skulls from Paracas in Peru, this suture is absent. The parietal bones are fused into a single structure. That is not a feature of cranial deformation. That is a feature of a skull that grew differently. The full genetic analysis, the kind of comprehensive genomic study that modern ancient DNA analysis could theoretically provide, has not been done with proper scientific protocols on a sufficient sample of these skulls. The questions they raise remain unanswered, but the skulls exist. The anomalies are visible, and the questions they raise remain open. The climax, the seventh civilization. Are we the Atlanteans now? We need to talk about what we're actually doing here, not what we like to think we're doing. What we're actually doing. In 200 years, 2 centuries, less than 10 generations, we have transformed this planet more dramatically than any known civilization in the history of the Earth. We have burned enough fossil fuel to measurably alter the chemical composition of the atmosphere. We have caused the 6th mass extinction event in Earth's 4.5 billion year history. We have moved enough soil and rock through our mining, construction, and agricultural activities that geologists now classify us as a geological force on par with tectonic activity in terms of landscape transformation. We have split the atom. We have decoded the genome. We have built machines that think faster than we do. We have placed communication satellites in orbit and connected 3 billion people to each other instantaneously across the entire surface of the planet. We have built nuclear weapons capable of making large portions of the Earth's surface uninhabitable for generations. We have done all of this in 200 years. The pyramid at Giza took 20 years to build and has been standing for 4,500 years. We have 0.0044% of that stability. Now, let's be honest about something that our culture works very hard to avoid being honest about. We don't know what we're doing. Not on the largest scales. We understand the individual mechanisms perfectly. We understand the chemistry of combustion, the physics of atmospheric radiation, the biology of species interaction. What we don't understand, what we genuinely cannot model with sufficient resolution, is how all of these changes interact with the unimaginably complex system of a living planet across century and millennium timescales. We're running an experiment. The experiment is unprecedented. The variables are too numerous to track. The timescales extend beyond any individual human life, beyond any political system, beyond any institution's planning horizon. And we're doing it to the only planet we have. Now imagine a researcher from the year 15,000 CE, standing in whatever their equivalent of a university is, trying to reconstruct the civilization that existed in the early 21st century. What will they find? The oceans will have chemically processed most of our plastic. Our steel structures will have corroded into unrecognizable mineral deposits. Our concrete will have fractured and been consumed by vegetation and erosion. Our cities will be geological mounds, anthropogenic sediment deposits, distinguishable by their chemistry, but not their architecture. What will remain? Deep mine shafts carved into bedrock, nuclear waste repositories, still radioactive, clearly artificial, impossible to explain by natural processes, a global spike in atmospheric carbon frozen into ice cores, a mass extinction event visible in every sediment layer on Earth, traces of synthetic molecules that cannot exist without organic chemistry, and stone. Wherever we built in stone, the great monuments, the mountain faces we carved, the underground vaults we sealed, the stone will remain. That future researcher will look at the evidence and wonder, what were they doing? They burned so much, so fast. They changed so much in such a short time. Were they brilliant? Were they reckless? Were they both at once? The way civilizations often are when they're moving faster than their wisdom can keep pace with. Sound familiar? Because that is exactly the argument we are having right now about Atlantis. Plato described an empire of extraordinary achievement that grew corrupt, grew arrogant, grew convinced of its own superiority, grew hungry for more than it needed, and was destroyed by forces it could not control. He presented this as a moral lesson, a warning, an illustration of what happens when a civilization chooses wealth over wisdom, conquest over cooperation, short-term power over long-term sustainability. He was writing about Atlantis, but he might as well have been writing about us. The question is not whether a catastrophe will come. The history of this planet, the honest, complete history that includes the 6 civilizations before ours, makes clear that catastrophes come. They are not exceptional events. They are the punctuation marks of Earth's long story. The question is whether we will be the civilization that saw it coming and responded wisely, or the civilization that was too busy accelerating to notice the cliff. And here is where the analysis gets genuinely hopeful, because the record also shows something else. Life continues. Knowledge continues. Every time a civilization collapsed, every drowned coastline, every buried Göbekli Tepe, every destroyed library, every lost mechanism, something survived. Some people got out. Some knowledge was preserved. Some thread of accumulated human wisdom was carried forward by someone, somewhere, into the next cycle. That's what resilience looks like, not invulnerability, not the ability to prevent catastrophe. Resilience is the capacity to carry what matters through the darkness, to preserve the seeds of the next cycle in the worst conditions the current cycle can produce. Our responsibility as the 7th civilization, if we are the 7th, if the pattern holds, if the wheel keeps turning, is not to stop the wheel. We may not be able to do that. Our responsibility is to be the civilization that does not pretend the wheel doesn't exist, to build not just for maximum speed, but for maximum resilience, not just for peak power, but for sustainable wisdom, not just for the next quarter's results, but for the next civilization's inheritance. The Egyptians built their knowledge into geometry. The Andeans built their knowledge into stone. The architects of Göbekli Tepe buried their sanctuary to protect it from what was coming. They were all trying to do the same thing, send a message forward through time to whoever came next. The question is whether we will hear it, whether we will look at those impossible stones, at those terraced structures under 100 feet of Pacific water, at those polygonal walls that have survived 5 centuries of Andean earthquakes, at that lone crank-operated computer sitting in a museum in Athens, and understand that they are not anomalies. They are addresses, left by people who knew that knowledge is the only thing that survives the resets. Not gold, not armies, not monuments, ultimately. Knowledge. The understanding of how the world works, why it works that way, and what it requires of the beings who live in it. They built in stone because stone lasts. They encoded in mathematics because mathematics is a language that doesn't need a translator. They told the story in myth because myth is a carrier frequency that survives even when the signal content is distorted by time. They were leaving us a message. They were telling us we were here. We knew things. We made mistakes. We were ended. Learn from us. The message has been sitting in the stone for 12,000 years. We are the first civilization in this cycle with the technology to actually hear it. The question that keeps every honest thinker up at night is not, did these civilizations exist? The question is, why did we stop listening? Closing call to action. You've traveled a long distance tonight. You went down to the bottom of the Pacific and looked at stones that shouldn't be there. You stood in Plato's shadow and wrestled with a story that's either the most important historical document we have or the most consequential philosophical allegory ever written. You stared at Arctic maps that knew things they shouldn't have known. You heard the whisper of the Pacific's memories. You watched the antediluvian world drown, slowly, generation by generation, until all that was left was the myth. You traced the hands of the master builders across 5 continents and 12,000 years of impossible precision. You met the destroyers, not as monsters in legend, but as forces of physics and geology that have already pressed the reset button 6 times and will press it again. And you held in your hands the Antikythera mechanism, the Baghdad batteries, the elongated skulls, the physical evidence that refuses to be fully explained away. And now you're here, at the end of the inventory, at the edge of the question. We are the 7th civilization. We are, by any measure, the most technologically capable one. We are moving faster than any previous civilization we have evidence of. We are changing our planet at a rate and scale that has no precedent in any timescale relevant to human experience. And we are doing all of this while largely ignoring the messages that the previous 6 left in stone. If this video made you think, if it made you uncomfortable, if it made you want to dig deeper, then it has done its job. Not to convince you of any specific version of these stories, not to replace scientific skepticism with credulous wonder, but to make you a little less comfortable with the neat, linear climax at the present version of human history that we're all trained to accept without question. Because the stones don't fit that version, and the stones were here before the textbooks. If you want to keep going, subscribe. Every video we make is another excavation, another layer of sediment carefully removed. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next descent into deep time. And if you made it to the end, drop a comment. Tell me what cracked something open for you. Tell me what you're going to go read about next. Tell me where you are in the world right now, watching this, thinking about the stones. The seventh civilization is still writing its story. Let's make sure it's a story worth leaving behind.